The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his scarlet tunic one final time. 23 years of service had taught him that precision and appearance meant everything, but today felt different. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat seemed heavier, the gold braiding on his uniform somehow more significant. He had no idea that within hours, his life would change forever, along with the lives of every person in the United Kingdom. James had joined the Queen's Guard straight from school, a working-class boy from Manchester whose father had served in the same regiment. The tradition ran in his blood, though he never imagined he would witness history in the making. His morning routine was identical to thousands of others before it. Polish boots until they reflected like mirrors, press uniform until every crease was razor-sharp, and mentally prepare for another day protecting the most famous woman in the world. The radio in the guardhouse crackled to life as James finished his preparation. Nothing unusual at first, just the standard security briefings and weather reports. But something in the duty officer's voice seemed strained, more serious than usual. The other guards noticed it too. Corporal Williams, who had been making jokes about the tourists they would encounter that day, suddenly fell silent. The atmosphere in the room shifted, though none of them could explain why. At precisely 8:30, James took his position outside the castle's main entrance. The early morning tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the changing of the guard. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, while their parents explained the significance of the red-coated soldiers who stood motionless like statues. James had perfected the art of remaining perfectly still while being fully aware of everything around him. It was a skill that took years to master. The September sun was beginning to break through the clouds when James noticed increased activity inside the castle grounds. More officials than usual were moving with purpose across the courtyards. Black vehicles arrived and departed with unusual frequency. The radio chatter in his earpiece became more urgent, though he could only catch fragments of conversations. Something significant was happening, but the nature of it remained unclear. Around mid-morning, James observed members of the royal household staff moving with a solemnity he had rarely seen. Their faces were grave, their usual cheerful demeanor replaced with something that looked like worry, or perhaps grief. The tourists outside seemed oblivious to any change, continuing their excited chatter about the castle's history and hoping to spot a member of the royal family. It was just after 11 o'clock when the duty officer approached James directly, something that almost never happened during a guard duty. The officer's face was pale, his usual composure clearly shaken. Without breaking his stance or moving his eyes, James listened as the officer whispered words that would echo in his mind forever. "The Queen's health is failing rapidly. She's at Balmoral. All leave is cancelled and we're moving to the highest security protocol." The weight of those words hit James like a physical blow, though he showed no outward reaction. Queen Elizabeth had been the only monarch he had ever known, the constant presence that had defined his entire career and, in many ways, his entire life. She was 6 years old, and while everyone knew this day would eventually come, the reality of it felt surreal and overwhelming. Throughout the afternoon, James watched as the castle transformed around him. Senior officials arrived continuously, their faces grave and purposeful. The media began gathering outside the gates in larger numbers than usual, though they seemed to sense that something significant was developing without knowing exactly what. James remained at his post, maintaining the stoic composure expected of a Queen's Guard while processing the enormity of what was unfolding. The tourists gradually sensed the change in atmosphere. Conversations became more subdued and many began checking their mobile phones more frequently. Social media was beginning to buzz with rumors and speculation, though official confirmation remained elusive. James could see the uncertainty in people's faces, the growing awareness that something momentous was happening within the ancient walls he protected. As the afternoon wore on, James reflected on his years of service and the countless times he had stood in this very spot. He remembered the day he first put on the uniform, the pride his father had shown, and the promise he had made to serve with honor and dedication. He thought about the Queen herself, whom he had seen many times over the years, always dignified and gracious, always aware of the weight of her responsibilities. The evening brought no relief from the tension that had been building throughout the day. James was relieved by another guard for a brief break, and in the guardhouse, the conversation was hushed and worried. The senior officers were clearly receiving regular updates, but they shared little information with the rank and file. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, made worse by the fact that they all knew their roles would be crucial in whatever was to come. When James returned to his post for the evening shift, the crowd outside had grown considerably. News vehicles lined the approach to the castle, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metallic flowers seeking the sun. Reporters spoke in urgent whispers to their cameras, trying to piece together the fragments of information that were emerging. The royal standard still flew above the castle, but everyone seemed to be watching it with unusual intensity. As darkness fell over Windsor, James remained at his post, a red-coated sentinel in an increasingly uncertain world. The castle's ancient stones seemed to hold their breath, waiting for news that would change everything. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the Thames Valley as they had for centuries, marking time that suddenly felt both precious and fleeting. The night brought little rest for anyone at Windsor. James could see lights burning in windows that were usually dark, evidence of the continuous activity within the royal household. Security was heightened, with additional guards posted at every entrance, and patrol routes doubled. The sense that history was unfolding was palpable, though its exact nature remained shrouded in official silence and growing public speculation. Just before midnight, as James prepared for the changing of the guard, he received another whispered update from his commanding officer. The Queen's condition had worsened significantly. Family members were traveling to Balmoral from around the world. The nation, though not yet officially informed, was preparing for the unthinkable. As James handed over his post to the night guard, he knew that the next time he stood duty, the world would likely be a very different place. The guardhouse was unusually quiet as the day shift prepared to depart. Conversations that would normally be filled with jokes and plans for the evening were replaced by subdued discussions about duty rosters and emergency protocols. Everyone understood that they were part of something historic, though none could fully comprehend the magnitude of what lay ahead. As James made his way to his quarters, he passed through the same corridors he had walked thousands of times before. Tonight they felt different, charged with anticipation and dread. The portraits of previous monarchs that lined the walls seemed to watch him with particular intensity, as if they too were aware that change was coming. The very air seemed to vibrate with the weight of centuries of history and tradition. In his small room, James sat on his narrow bed and thought about his family back in Manchester. His father, who had instilled in him the values of service and duty, would understand the significance of these moments. His mother, who had always worried about her son's chosen profession, would be proud of how he was handling this unprecedented situation. His younger sister, who had never fully grasped why her brother chose to spend his life in service to the monarchy, might finally understand. The early hours of September 8th brought little sleep for James or any of the guards at Windsor. The radio chatter continued throughout the night, with updates flowing in from Balmoral and Buckingham Palace. Senior officials came and went with increasing frequency, their faces betraying the gravity of the situation despite their attempts to maintain normal appearances. As dawn approached, James prepared for what he somehow knew would be one of the most significant days of his life. The routine of preparing his uniform took on almost ritual significance. Each brushstroke on his boots, each adjustment of his tunic, carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of duty, fulfilled regardless of personal cost. The morning of September 8, 2022, would be etched in James Mitchell's memory forever. As he took his position once again outside Windsor Castle, the September air crisp with the promise of autumn, he had no way of knowing that within hours, the longest reign in British history would come to an end, and his role as guardian of the monarchy would take on dimensions he had never imagined possible. The afternoon of September 8th brought an unusual stillness to Windsor Castle that James had never experienced before. Even the ancient stones seemed to hold their breath as news filtered through the official channels. At precisely 6:30 p.m., the announcement came through his radio earpiece with devastating clarity. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle. The voice delivering the news was steady and professional, but James could detect the underlying emotion that threatened to break through the military composure. James felt the ground beneath his feet shift, not physically, but in every way that mattered. The woman he had sworn to protect, the sovereign he had served with unwavering dedication for over 2 decades, was gone. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, had breathed her last breath in the Scottish Highlands she loved so dearly. Within moments of the official announcement, Windsor Castle transformed into the epicenter of the most significant constitutional and ceremonial undertaking in modern British history. Operation London Bridge, the carefully choreographed plan for the Queen's death that had been refined over decades, sprang into immediate action. James watched as officials who had seemed tense all day suddenly moved with the precision of clockwork, each knowing their exact role in the machinery of state that would guide the nation through this unprecedented transition. The media presence outside the castle gates exploded exponentially. What had been a modest gathering of reporters in the morning became a sea of satellite trucks, cameras, and journalists from around the world within hours. The iron railings that James had guarded for so many years now held back not just curious tourists, but the entire weight of global attention focused on this ancient seat of royal power. As darkness fell on September 8th, James witnessed something he had only read about in training manuals and historical accounts. The royal standard was lowered to half-mast, a sight so rare and significant that even the most experienced members of the castle staff paused in their duties to watch. The flag's slow descent in the evening breeze carried with it the weight of 70 years of reign, a lifetime of service, and the end of an era that had defined modern Britain. The night shift brought no rest for the Queen's Guard. Security protocols shifted to the highest possible level as the castle prepared to receive world leaders, dignitaries, and members of the royal family who would converge on Windsor in the coming days. James found himself part of a security apparatus that had to be both ceremonial and completely functional, maintaining the dignity and tradition of the monarchy while protecting those who would soon carry its future. In the guardhouse during a brief break, James overheard senior officers discussing the logistics of what lay ahead. The funeral would be unlike anything the country had seen since Winston Churchill's state funeral in 1965. But even that paled in comparison to what was being planned. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers from across the globe would attend. The ceremonial aspects would require precision that left no room for error, while the security considerations were mind-boggling in their complexity. Throughout that first night as the new Carolean age began, James reflected on the personal dimensions of his loss. The Queen had been more than a distant figure to him. She had been the embodiment of everything he had sworn to protect. He remembered the occasions when she had inspected the guard, her keen eyes noting every detail of their turnout, her gracious acknowledgement of their service. She had been a small woman in physical stature, but her presence had filled any room she entered. The morning of September 9th brought a new reality that would define the rest of James's career. King Charles III was now the sovereign he served, and the transition was both immediate and profound. New protocols were implemented, new security arrangements put in place, and new traditions began to take shape alongside the ancient ones that continued unchanged. The monarchy was dead. Long live the monarchy. Windsor Castle became a hub of activity unlike anything James had ever witnessed. Royal household staff moved with urgent purpose, preparing for the arrival of family members who would need accommodation, comfort, and protection during the most difficult period of their lives. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, were among the first to arrive, their faces showing the strain of personal grief combined with the weight of new responsibilities. The public's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Flowers began arriving at the castle gates within hours of the announcement, first as small bouquets left by local residents, then as a growing river of floral tributes from across Britain and beyond. James watched from his post as people of all ages and backgrounds came to pay their respects, many in tears, all clearly affected by the magnitude of what had occurred. As the days progressed, James observed the delicate balance between public mourning and private grief that the royal family had to navigate. Prince William and Prince Harry arrived together, setting aside their well-documented differences in the face of their shared loss. The sight of the brothers walking together through the castle grounds, clearly supporting each other in their grief, reminded James of the human dimensions of the institution he protected. The logistics of the lying-in state period required careful coordination between multiple agencies and departments. James found himself working closely with police units, military personnel, and security services from across the Commonwealth as plans were finalized for the Queen's journey from Balmoral to Edinburgh, then to London, and finally to Windsor for her burial. Each stage required different protocols, different security measures, and different ceremonial elements. The arrival of the Queen's coffin at Windsor was a moment James knew he would remember for the rest of his life. The hearse moved slowly through streets lined with mourners, past landmarks that had defined her reign, finally arriving at the castle she had called home for so many years. The sight of the coffin draped in the royal standard, topped with the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter was both magnificent and heartbreaking. Inside the castle, James witnessed the private moments of grief that the public would never see. Family members arriving to pay their respects. Staff members who had served the Queen for decades struggling to maintain their composure. The quiet conversations in corridors as people processed their loss and prepared for the enormous challenge of organizing a state funeral that would be watched by billions around the world. The international response was unprecedented. Messages of condolence poured in from every corner of the globe, from world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. James helped coordinate security for the arriving dignitaries, each requiring specific protocols and protection measures. The President of the United States, the Emperor of Japan, European monarchs, African presidents, and Commonwealth prime ministers would all gather at Windsor, creating security challenges that tested every system and procedure. During quieter moments, James thought about the constitutional implications of what was occurring. The Queen had been not just the head of state for the United Kingdom, but the sovereign of 15 other nations and the head of the Commonwealth comprising 54 countries. Her death triggered constitutional processes across the globe, from the swearing-in of new parliaments to the updating of currency and official portraits. The media coverage was relentless and global. James could see the reporters working around the clock outside the castle gates, beaming images and stories to every continent. The British Broadcasting Corporation had suspended all regular programming, and similar coverage was being provided by networks worldwide. The Queen's death was not just British news. It was the defining global story of the generation. As September progressed toward the funeral date, James saw Windsor Castle transform into something he had never experienced before. The ancient buildings that had housed monarchs for nearly 1,000 years now prepared to say farewell to the sovereign who had lived there longer than any other. The Great Park, where the Queen had ridden horses and walked her corgis, became staging areas for the massive security and logistical operation required for the funeral. The rehearsals for the funeral ceremony were conducted with military precision. James participated in numerous practice runs, ensuring that every aspect of the ceremonial elements would proceed flawlessly. The timing had to be exact, the positioning perfect, and the coordination seamless. There would be no opportunity for correction or adjustment during the actual ceremony. Everything had to be perfect from the first moment to the last. The personal toll of these days was significant for everyone involved. James found himself working longer hours than ever before, with little time to process his own grief while maintaining the professional standards required of the Queen's Guard. The weight of responsibility was enormous, knowing that any failure in their duties would be witnessed by a global audience of unprecedented size and significance. In the evenings, when duties permitted, James would walk through the castle grounds and reflect on the magnitude of what was unfolding. The Queen had touched the lives of billions of people during her 70-year reign, and now those same people were looking to Windsor Castle as the focal point for their grief, their memories, and their hopes for the future under King Charles. The responsibility of guarding and protecting that process was both humbling and overwhelming. The morning of September 19th dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, as if nature itself was paying respects to the Queen on her final day above ground. James had been awake since 3 in the morning, preparing for what would be the most challenging and significant day of his military career. The state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II would be watched by an estimated 4 billion people worldwide, making it potentially the most viewed event in human history. James's preparation routine took on an almost sacred quality that morning. Each brushstroke on his boots was deliberate and reverent. The pressing of his uniform was performed with the precision of a religious ritual. Every piece of brass was polished until it gleamed like gold in the early morning light streaming through the guardhouse windows. He knew that every detail of his appearance would be scrutinized by cameras that would broadcast his image across the globe. The security arrangements for the funeral were unlike anything ever attempted in peacetime. James had been briefed on protocols that involved not just the British military and police forces, but security services from dozens of nations whose leaders would attend. The guest list read like a roll call of world power. President Biden representing the United States, President Macron from France, the Emperor and Empress of Japan, and monarchs from across Europe and beyond. As James took his position in the early morning hours, he could see the final preparations being completed around him. Television crews had been working through the night to ensure perfect coverage of every moment. The route from Westminster Abbey to Windsor had been prepared with military precision, every potential security risk assessed and addressed, every ceremonial detail rehearsed until it could be performed flawlessly even under the enormous pressure of global scrutiny. The atmosphere inside Windsor Castle was unlike anything James had experienced in his 23 years of service. There was a palpable sense of history in the making, combined with the deep personal grief of those who had known and loved the Queen. Staff members who had served her for decades moved through their duties with red-rimmed eyes and determined professionalism, knowing that their final service to their beloved sovereign had to be perfect. The arrival of the funeral procession at Windsor was a moment that would be etched in James's memory forever. The sight of the Queen's coffin being drawn by the same gun carriage that had carried her father, King George VI, more than 70 years earlier, created a direct link to the past that was both moving and profound. The rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves on the ancient cobblestones of Castle Hill seemed to mark time itself, each step bringing the longest reign in British history to its ceremonial close. James watched as members of the royal family followed behind the coffin on foot, their faces showing the strain of public grief combined with private loss. King Charles, now bearing the full weight of the crown, walked with dignity despite the obvious emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Prince William and Prince Harry, united in their grief despite their recent differences, flanked their father in a display of family solidarity that moved even the most hardened observers. The precision required for the ceremonial aspects of the funeral was extraordinary. Every step had been measured, every timing calculated to the second. James and his fellow guards had rehearsed their roles countless times, but the reality of performing them under such circumstances was entirely different. The weight of tradition, the pressure of global attention, and the personal significance of the occasion combined to create an almost surreal atmosphere of intense focus and emotional depth. Inside St. George's Chapel, where the Queen would be laid to rest beside her beloved husband Prince Philip, James could see the final preparations being completed. The chapel, which had witnessed royal weddings, christenings, and funerals for centuries, had been transformed into a setting worthy of the most significant royal funeral in generations. Every detail had been planned with meticulous care, from the placement of flowers to the positioning of cameras that would share this moment with the world. The international representation at the funeral was staggering in its scope and significance. James helped coordinate the arrival and positioning of delegations from nations that had rarely, if ever, been represented together in the same space. Sworn enemies sat in proximity to each other, united in their respect for the Queen, who had somehow managed to maintain relationships with leaders across the political spectrum throughout her remarkable reign. As the funeral service proceeded, James found himself thinking about the Queen's extraordinary life and the changes she had witnessed during her 7 decades on the throne. She had reigned during the Cold War, seen the dissolution of the British Empire and the rise of the Commonwealth, witnessed technological revolutions that transformed human communication, and guided her nation through countless crises with steady determination and unwavering devotion to duty. The moment when the imperial state crown was removed from the Queen's coffin carried profound symbolic weight that was not lost on James or anyone else present. This simple action marked the end of the Elizabethan era and the formal beginning of the reign of King Charles III. The crown that had adorned the Queen's head during countless state occasions would now be held in trust for the next generation, a physical representation of the continuity that defines the British monarchy. The lowering of the Queen's coffin into the royal vault was conducted with such precision and dignity that it seemed to transcend mere ceremony and become something approaching the sacred. James, standing at attention with his fellow guards, felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a physical presence. This was not just the end of a life, but the conclusion of an era that had defined the modern world in countless ways. Following the formal funeral service, the private burial ceremony for family members only took place in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. James maintained his position outside, protecting the privacy of the royal family's most intimate moments of grief. He could hear the gentle sound of hymns being sung inside the chapel, voices raised in final tribute to a woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to the service of her people. The logistics of managing the departure of world leaders and dignitaries after the funeral required careful coordination that had been planned for months in advance. James watched as the most powerful people on Earth paid their final respects and began their journeys home, each carrying with them memories of a ceremony that had demonstrated the enduring power of tradition and the universal nature of human grief. In the hours following the funeral, as Windsor Castle began to return to something resembling normal operations, James reflected on what he had witnessed and participated in. The death of Queen Elizabeth II had triggered the largest gathering of world leaders in recent history, demonstrating her unique position in global affairs and the respect she had earned through 7 decades of dedicated service. The media coverage of the funeral was extraordinary in its scope and technical achievement. James learned later that the ceremony had indeed been watched by approximately 4 billion people worldwide, making it one of the most significant shared human experiences in history. The fact that he had played a role, however small, in facilitating this global moment of remembrance and transition filled him with a sense of pride and purpose that would last for the rest of his life. As evening fell on September 19th, James found himself walking through the castle grounds where Queen Elizabeth had spent so many happy years. The great park, where she had ridden horses and enjoyed the peaceful countryside, seemed different somehow, as if it too was mourning the loss of the woman who had loved it so deeply. The ancient trees stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time and the changing of the guard from one era to the next. The personal impact of the day's events was only beginning to be felt as James prepared for the night shift. The adrenaline and intense focus required for the funeral had sustained him through the most challenging day of his career, but now the emotional weight of what had occurred was starting to settle in his consciousness. He had been part of history, a small but essential component in the machinery that had guided Britain and the Commonwealth through one of the most significant transitions in modern times. In the guardhouse, conversations among the guards were subdued and reflective. Everyone understood that they had participated in something unique and unrepeatable. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II would be studied by historians for generations to come, analyzed for its symbolism, its political significance, and its demonstration of the enduring power of ceremonial monarchy in the modern world. As James prepared for his final duties of this historic day, he thought about the future and what it would mean to serve under King Charles III. The new reign would bring its own challenges and opportunities, its own traditions and innovations. But the fundamental purpose of the Queen's Guard would remain unchanged: to protect and serve the institution of the monarchy with honor, dignity, and unwavering dedication to duty. The weeks following Queen Elizabeth's funeral brought a strange new rhythm to Windsor Castle that James struggled to adapt to. The intense global attention had gradually subsided. World leaders had returned to their own nations, and the massive security apparatus that had surrounded the funeral had been carefully dismantled. Yet something fundamental had changed in the very atmosphere of the place James had called home for over 2 decades. King Charles III had officially begun his reign, and with it came subtle but significant changes to daily operations at Windsor. The new king's preferences, schedules, and protocols were different from those of his mother, requiring adjustments to routines that had remained largely unchanged for decades. James found himself learning new procedures while simultaneously mourning the loss of the familiar patterns that had defined his service under Queen Elizabeth. The castle itself seemed to echo with memories of the Queen's presence. James would find himself glancing toward windows where she had often appeared, listening for the sound of her voice in corridors where she had walked thousands of times before. The royal apartments that had been her private retreat now stood empty, being gradually prepared for their next occupant, while preserving the dignity and respect owed to their previous resident. One of the most challenging aspects of this transition period was managing the continued flow of visitors who came to pay their respects to the Queen's memory. The floral tributes that had initially overwhelmed the castle gates had been carefully collected and composted in the castle gardens, creating a living memorial that would bloom in seasons to come. But people continued to arrive daily, seeking some connection to the woman who had defined their understanding of monarchy and national identity. James observed the royal family's ongoing process of grief and adjustment with the discretion that his position required. King Charles, while taking on his new responsibilities with evident dedication, clearly carried the weight of his personal loss. The sight of the new king walking through the castle grounds where he had spent time with his mother throughout his life provided James with insights into the human dimensions of royal duty that the public rarely witnessed. The Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, had taken on increased responsibilities that brought them to Windsor more frequently. James watched as they balanced their own grief with the demands of their elevated positions, working to maintain the stability and continuity that the monarchy represented while adapting to roles they had not expected to assume quite so soon. The staff at Windsor Castle faced their own challenges during this period of transition. Many had served Queen Elizabeth for decades, developing personal relationships with her that went beyond mere professional duty. James witnessed their struggles to maintain their composure while adapting to new expectations and procedures under King Charles. The emotional toll was evident in quiet conversations and occasional moments when grief would suddenly overwhelm even the most professional demeanor. The logistical challenges of maintaining security and operations during this transition were immense. James worked closely with new security protocols, designed to protect King Charles while maintaining the openness and accessibility that had characterized Queen Elizabeth's approach to public engagement. The balance between security and tradition required constant adjustment and refinement as the new reign found its footing. International relations continued to evolve in the aftermath of the Queen's death, with King Charles beginning to establish his own diplomatic relationships and approaches. James observed delegations arriving for meetings with the new king, each interaction helping to define the character and direction of the new reign. The Commonwealth nations in particular watched carefully to see how King Charles would maintain the relationships his mother had so carefully cultivated over 7 decades. The media's relationship with the monarchy also began to shift during this period. James noticed changes in the way reporters and photographers approached their coverage of royal activities at Windsor. There was a more respectful distance, perhaps influenced by the global outpouring of affection for Queen Elizabeth and recognition of the genuine grief being experienced by her family. The sensationalistic approach that had sometimes characterized royal coverage in the past seemed temporarily subdued by the magnitude of recent events. Personal reflections became increasingly important for James during these weeks. He found himself thinking not just about his own future in the service, but about the broader meaning of his 2 decades of duty under Queen Elizabeth. The values she had embodied, service, duty, dignity, and unwavering commitment to her people, had become part of his own identity. Adapting those same values to service under King Charles represented both a challenge and an opportunity for continued growth. The changing seasons provided a natural backdrop for this period of transition. Autumn was settling over Windsor Great Park, painting the ancient trees in brilliant colors that seemed to reflect the bittersweet nature of the times. James had always found peace in the natural beauty surrounding the castle, but now it seemed to carry additional significance as a reminder of the cycles of life and the continuity that transcends individual reigns. Visitors to Windsor during this period often commented on the palpable sense of history that seemed to permeate every stone and garden path. James overheard countless conversations as people tried to process their own feelings about the Queen's death and what it meant for their understanding of Britain and its place in the world. The castle had become not just a tourist destination, but a pilgrimage site for those seeking to connect with something larger than themselves. The practical aspects of adjusting to King Charles's reign required attention to countless details that the public never saw. Different security protocols, modified ceremonial procedures, and new daily routines all had to be implemented seamlessly while maintaining the appearance of unchanging tradition. James and his fellow guards worked diligently to master these changes, knowing that any visible uncertainty or confusion would undermine the stability that the monarchy was meant to represent. Training programs for the Queen's Guard were updated to reflect the new reign's requirements, while preserving the essential traditions that defined their service. James participated in these sessions, sharing his experience while learning new approaches that would serve him well in the years ahead. The balance between honoring the past and adapting to the present became a constant theme in all aspects of castle operations. The Queen's beloved corgis, now in the care of other family members, had been a constant presence around Windsor for decades. Their absence was felt keenly by staff and guards who had become accustomed to their companionship during long days of duty. The silence in areas where their playful barking had once echoed seemed to underscore the magnitude of the changes that had occurred. Cultural and artistic tributes to Queen Elizabeth continued to arrive at Windsor, reflecting the global impact of her life and reign. James helped coordinate the reception of paintings, sculptures, musical compositions, and literary works created by artists around the world who wanted to express their admiration and gratitude. The diversity and quality of these tributes provided evidence of the Queen's influence far beyond the political and constitutional spheres. The relationship between Windsor Castle and the local community also evolved during this transition period. Townspeople who had grown accustomed to the Queen's presence for over 7 decades now had to adjust to her absence while welcoming King Charles as their new neighbor. James observed the careful diplomacy involved in maintaining these relationships while respecting the community's grief and the royal family's need for privacy. Educational groups visiting Windsor during this period brought questions and perspectives that challenged James to think more deeply about the institution he served. Students from universities around the world came to study the monarchy's role in modern governance, the significance of the Queen's reign, and the challenges facing King Charles as he established his own approach to royal duty. These interactions provided James with opportunities to articulate his own understanding of service and tradition. As October progressed, James began to sense a gradual stabilization in the castle's operations and atmosphere. The immediate shock and grief of the Queen's death were giving way to a more sustainable routine that honored her memory while embracing the reality of the new reign. King Charles's confidence in his role was growing, and the staff's adaptation to his preferences and procedures was becoming more natural and fluid. The approaching first Christmas of the new reign presented its own challenges and opportunities for James and the entire Windsor Castle community. Traditional celebrations would need to balance respect for the Queen's memory with the joy and hope that the season represented. Planning for these events required sensitivity to the royal family's emotional state while maintaining the public expectations that surrounded royal Christmas traditions. Through all of these transitions and challenges, James found strength in the fundamental values that had guided his service throughout his career. The commitment to duty, honor, and service that Queen Elizabeth had embodied remained as relevant under King Charles as it had been during her remarkable 70-year reign. The forms might change, but the essence of what it meant to be a Queen's Guard remained constant and inspiring. As winter settled over Windsor Castle, James Mitchell stood once again at his familiar post, but everything had changed. 6 months had passed since Queen Elizabeth's death, and the new reality of serving under King Charles III had become the established norm rather than a painful adjustment. The scarlet tunic felt the same, the bearskin hat carried the same weight, but the purpose and meaning of his service had evolved in ways he was still discovering. The first Christmas under the new reign had passed with dignity and appropriate celebration, marking a milestone in the royal family's journey through grief toward acceptance and renewed purpose. James had observed King Charles navigating the delicate balance between honoring his mother's memory and establishing his own traditions. The Christmas broadcast, delivered from Windsor Castle, had struck exactly the right tone, acknowledging loss while looking forward with hope and determination. Throughout the winter months, James watched as Windsor Castle settled into new rhythms that reflected King Charles's personality and priorities. The king's passion for environmental conservation brought subtle but meaningful changes to castle operations. Gardens were managed with greater emphasis on sustainability. Energy usage was scrutinized and reduced where possible, and organic farming practices were implemented in areas that had previously used conventional methods. The staff at Windsor had gradually adapted to serving a new sovereign, though the adjustment process had not been without its emotional challenges. James noticed that longtime staff members would sometimes pause in corridors where Queen Elizabeth had regularly walked, as if still expecting to encounter her familiar figure. The grief was persistent, but had evolved from acute pain into a gentle melancholy that added depth rather than despair to daily life at the castle. International relationships under the new reign were taking shape in ways that reflected both continuity and change. James observed diplomatic visitors arriving with increasing frequency as King Charles worked to establish his own approach to Commonwealth leadership and international engagement. The relationships his mother had built over decades provided a foundation, but each interaction required the king to demonstrate his own character and vision for Britain's role in the world. The media's coverage of the royal family had evolved significantly since the Queen's death and funeral. James noticed a more respectful approach from journalists and photographers, perhaps influenced by the global demonstration of affection for Queen Elizabeth and recognition of the genuine dignity with which her family had handled their loss. The sensationalistic tendencies that had sometimes characterized royal reporting seemed to have been tempered by recent events. Spring's arrival brought renewed energy to Windsor Castle and its grounds. James found particular meaning in watching the gardens bloom with flowers that had been planted in Queen Elizabeth's honor during the previous autumn. Two cities, the cycle of seasons provided a natural metaphor for the transition from mourning to renewal that characterized this period in the monarchy's history. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, had grown into their elevated roles with grace and apparent confidence. James observed their increased presence at Windsor and their growing comfort in taking on responsibilities that had previously belonged to Queen Elizabeth. Their children, now in line of succession closer to the throne, brought youthful energy to the castle that seemed to brighten even the most formal occasions. Training new members of the Queen's Guard took on special significance during this period. James found himself serving as a mentor to young soldiers who had joined the service after Queen Elizabeth's death, helping them understand not just the practical aspects of their duties, but the deeper meaning of service to the crown. These conversations often led to discussions about tradition, change, and the enduring values that transcended individual reigns. The first anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death approached with careful planning and considerable emotion. James participated in preparations for memorial services and commemorative events that would mark this significant milestone, while maintaining the dignity and respect that characterized all royal observances. The challenge was to honor the Queen's memory without allowing grief to overshadow the progress that had been made under King Charles. Public interest in the monarchy had actually increased in many ways since Queen Elizabeth's death, as people around the world sought to understand and connect with an institution that had demonstrated remarkable resilience and continuity. James noticed that visitors to Windsor Castle often spoke with greater reverence about the history they were witnessing, perhaps more aware of the privilege of experiencing royal tradition in an age of rapid global change. The Commonwealth nations continued to navigate their relationships with the new king, each finding their own balance between honoring their connection to Queen Elizabeth's legacy and embracing King Charles's vision for the future. James observed delegations arriving from across the Commonwealth, each meeting contributing to the complex web of relationships that would define this new era of royal leadership. Personal growth had been an unexpected aspect of this transition period for James. The experience of serving through such a historic time had deepened his understanding of duty, loyalty, and service in ways that went far beyond military training or royal protocol. He found himself more reflective about his own values and more articulate about the meaning of his chosen profession. The Queen's beloved horses continued to be cared for at Windsor, though their routines had necessarily changed without her daily presence. James sometimes saw King Charles visiting the stables, and while he clearly appreciated the magnificent animals his mother had loved, his own relationship with them was different, more formal perhaps, but still respectful of their significance in royal tradition. Cultural tributes to Queen Elizabeth had evolved from immediate expressions of grief into more thoughtful artistic works that celebrated her life and legacy. James helped coordinate the reception of books, documentaries, musical compositions, and artistic installations that reflected deeper consideration of her historical significance. The quality and diversity of these works provided evidence of the Queen's lasting impact on global culture. Educational initiatives connected to Windsor Castle had expanded significantly since the Queen's death, as institutions around the world sought to study and understand the monarchy's role in modern society. James found himself occasionally interacting with researchers, historians, and students whose work contributed to a growing body of scholarship about royal institutions and their relevance in contemporary governance. The relationship between tradition and innovation became a constant theme in James's observations of the new reign. King Charles demonstrated respect for established protocols while implementing changes that reflected his own vision and the needs of a changing world. This balance required constant adjustment and diplomatic skill, qualities that the king displayed with increasing confidence and effectiveness. As summer approached, James reflected on the year that had passed since Queen Elizabeth's death and the remarkable journey of adaptation, growth, and renewal that had characterized this period. The monarchy had demonstrated its resilience and continued relevance, while the individual members of the royal family had shown grace and dignity in navigating personal grief while maintaining their public responsibilities. The future stretched ahead with both uncertainty and promise. James knew that his remaining years of service would be defined by the new reign's developing character and priorities. The fundamental values that had guided his career, duty, honor, service, and loyalty, remained unchanged, but their application would continue to evolve as King Charles established his own approach to royal leadership. Looking across Windsor Great Park toward the distant horizon, James felt a profound sense of satisfaction in having served during such a significant period in British history. He had been present for the end of the longest reign in the nation's history and the beginning of a new era that would undoubtedly bring its own challenges and triumphs. The red tunic he wore carried the weight of centuries of tradition, but it also represented the continuing vitality of an institution that had adapted and survived through countless transitions. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle would continue to shelter monarchs and their guards for generations to come. James's own service was finite, but his contribution to the unbroken chain of duty and dedication that defined the Queen's Guard would endure as part of the institution's living history. In serving both Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III, he had helped maintain the continuity that made the monarchy a source of stability and identity for millions of people around the world. The story of his service during Britain's national mourning and the transition to a new reign would become part of the larger narrative of the British monarchy's evolution in the 21st century. It was a story of loss and renewal, tradition and change, personal grief and public duty, all woven together in the ancient setting of Windsor Castle, where history continued to unfold with each passing day.